Thank you for listening to Mormon Sex Info. This episode is an archived episode and is only now becoming publicly available. Mormon Sex Info relies on contributions. To contribute, please visit mormonsex.info. And now, please enjoy this episode.
Hello and welcome to Mormon Sex Info. This is Natasha Helfer Parker, and today I have a repeat guest, Douglas Braun-Harvey. I'm so glad to have him back on the show. He's the co-author of Treating Out of Control Sexual Behavior with Michael Vigorito, and I had them both on the show, probably several months ago now, to talk about this new treatment protocol that they have come up with to deal with sexual behavior that feels out of control. For many, it is. For some, it feels like it is. So, that's a whole nother conversation. But one of the things that they do a great job talking about in this book are the 6 principles of sexual health. And I just thought it would be a really great idea to take a podcast for each principle, because each one, I think, is a lot more complicated than just a few words. And especially when it comes to setting up good sexual health for all of us, these are really important principles. So Doug has agreed to do this series with me, and I'm just thrilled to have him on. So welcome back to the show, Douglas.
Oh, thank you, Natasha. It is so good to be here, and I just so respect your work and what you're doing with this podcast, and to create this amount of space to have conversations about something as complex as sexual health, yet often goes sort of dismissed as being a very simple idea. I'm so glad you're sort of going to allow your listeners to maybe really have some thoughts about sexual health that maybe they haven't really had an opportunity to be invited into these thoughts. So I'm very, very happy to do this.
Well, thank you. That's lovely. I think, when you go through the 6 principles, which I've done on many podcasts, they can seem very kind of matter, they make sense, they're common sense, but when it gets to the living of them, or especially like you're mentioning the dialogue of them, it can be quite a bit more complicated.
Mm-hmm.
So today we're going to start with number 1, which is consent. I thought maybe we could just start with a working definition or ways that consent is usually defined, and we could even talk about non-consent. And so I just thought we'd start with our thoughts about how these things kind of tend to be defined in our culture.
I think one of the things about consent is it can be thought of legally, it can be thought of ethically, it can be thought of morally, and it can be thought of as sort of like social etiquette. And so consent has many dimensions. And so when we're really talking about consent from a sexual health principle, we're really talking about it in the context of human beings engaging in sexual activity with each other, or some form of sexual interplay. It may not be actual sexual activity, but this idea that when human beings engage in any kind of sexual or sexualized interaction, the fundamental principle, and this is true across the whole planet, the fundamental idea is that there's a level of that behavior that is supposed to be consensual between both or however many partners are involved. So another way to sort of think about consent is sort of voluntary cooperation, right? You're cooperating, but you're voluntarily cooperating. It's not like, all right, I'll do this because I have to. It's no, this is important. This is something that's important to me. That if I'm going to engage in sort of an intimacy or contact or a seduction or a sexual activity with somebody else, not only do I want that person to be giving me consent, but I want them to be invested in my consent as well.
Yeah, so right off the bat, you touch on a very interesting concept of voluntary desire and I think organic or intentional want versus duty. And this, I think, is one of the issues I'd like to get into. Maybe we'll just get into it right now and jump into it, even though it's not probably the first thing I want to talk about, but we'll just, be flexible here.
Okay, good.
Is this idea that, especially working with a lot of Mormon couples as I do, or conservative religious clients, we tend to have some patterns that we see over time. And a very typical one might be if the woman is the low desire partner, that there's a duty or a part of marriage where she feels like it's her job to keep her spouse satisfied. And so she will give quote unquote consent. She'll say yes, or she'll go along with whatever the sexual play or the sexual initiation is. And yet then talk in my office about the resentment and the sadness and, all of those complex feelings, because to your point, it's not really what we're talking about when we think about the hell yes approach, right? Like, I'm really into this, or I want to do this. So do we want to start there? I mean, it's probably an awkward place to start.
No. Actually, I think these are the real live situations. Let's start with where people are living. And these are real live moments people are having. I think one of the things I hear in your narrative of this particular situation is the distinction between three of the different sexual health principles that are in this story you just told me. That there's consent, there's exploitation, and there's shared values. In fact, actually, there's 4 or 5 of them. There's also being honest, and there's a pleasure. So in this narrative you just told me, it sounds like somebody, and in this case, it's one of the partners in a relationship, and typically it sounds like from a gendered perspective, it's a cisgendered female partner who's in a monogamous marriage, and they identify as Mormon or very conservative religious, and they have these, now I'm going to move to a different sexual health principle, some shared values that come from deeply held religious beliefs, scripture, it could be from a variety of sources, but these are shared values in the couple. It doesn't sound like the couple disagrees with the idea of this value. I don't know. Is the woman coming to your office saying this idea of a duty or a job to keep myself satisfied is a value I don't believe in? Or is it a value they believe in and they're having a difficult time figuring out how to have a pleasurable sexual life in that situation? Or are they actually choosing to let a partner have forced sex with them? They're in a forced sexual situation of non-consent as a way to uphold this value of duty.
Yeah, and I would say yes to all of the above. In other words, all of those can happen, right? And I think oftentimes it's one of these things that I think in monogamous relationships where there's been some type of a contract, either implied or stated, that, sexuality will only happen between you and I, right? The only outlet for sexuality is you and I. That there is some level of expectation, I think, that even just comes with marriage in general in our overall culture, that sexuality is going to be involved in that relationship. And if there's not going to be other outlets, that then when I'm confronted with your desire or your libido or your initiations, then I'm in a position to respond to that. And if there's no other outlets, and if we don't have, I think, great communication skills about this topic, which, I mean, who does? Who got taught how to do good sex negotiation? I don't think many people have. Can I
interrupt here, Natasha? Because I think you're bringing something that I want to just now discuss from a consent perspective. You've now described a situation where there's this duty motivation is really living in the moment in this couple. So my question would be for the male partner, where are his values? At what point is his perception of non-consent? When does that enter into the situation? When does he no longer want to engage in a sexual activity with his spouse because the perception is this is unwanted, or perhaps she's not even giving consent? Does the man then just continue with the sexual activity in that situation? Does the man perceive any responsibility to understand with duty comes the obligation to assess for consent?
Yeah, and I think that's a great concept to be talking about. That's exactly right. When I think about the narratives that we've been given, even in American culture, I think immediately to the black and white movies where, you see the man and he holds her tight and she's upset with him and she slaps him across the face and he is shocked, and then he strongly and firmly kisses her on the lips and she resists for a minute and then melts into his arms. And I'm like, holy crap, this is some real interesting negotiations around couples and the idea of consent that I think we've all grown up with. that has a lot more.
Well, let's make a distinction. That's entertainment.
Yes, yes.
And what I think you're saying is these conversations are so hard to come by, people rely on entertainment to get educated.
Absolutely. I think that happens a lot, especially in areas of sexuality, right? Whether it's kids looking at pornography, right, instead of having comprehensive sexual education in the school systems. I mean, there's so many. I think we would obviously both agree with that.
But I think for me, in these conversations, I like to remind listeners that's an entertainment forum. Movies are entertainment, sexual imagery for reaching orgasm, that's entertainment. I mean, these are manufactured products. These are products designed for a specific outcome of entertaining or pleasing another person. Those are not education. These are not teaching people. And I think that's a big thing I think people could talk about when they're sitting with clients is, are you using entertainment to understand how to function as a partner in a sexual relationship?
Yeah, and I think that most of us would probably agree that those types of entertainment forms, whether they're movies or cultural scripts that we've all grown up with, music, literature,
yes, right,
play a big role in, I think, the expectations that we've built up around sexuality. And I think of people who go to watch like the Fast and Furious movies, for example. Most people probably don't walk out of that and drive their cars the way that you would see in Fast and Furious.
Wouldn't think of that as driver's ed, right?
Right.
I learned how to drive a car. I went and saw Fast and the Furious. It would be preposterous for us to say that.
Exactly. And yet I think that a lot of expectations and kind of the romantic Western narrative is something that a lot of expectations are built around when it comes to media, unfortunately, when it comes to that's my theory. I don't know.
Let's use the driver's ed version of this. I think the reason people don't go to the Fast and Furious and think of that as a driver's education lesson is because we do provide people driver's education lessons. We have licenses for driving. We have rules of the road. We really do a pretty good job of telling people how to operate a several-ton vehicle at 70 miles an hour without killing everybody. We do a pretty good job of that. So we don't need entertainment to be confused with education because we do the education. We don't do the education around consent very well at all in our society. So when there's not good education, these other media carries the burden because it's the only place it gets talked about or shown or demonstrated or modeled.
Correct. Or to your point earlier, possibly in religious narratives like scripture or things that maybe religious leaders would talk about who are not necessarily relational experts. So there's definitely some concerns, I think, too, as far as where people go to find their roles. And if the role is to be a good, loving spouse, but that's been scripted to meet the spouse's needs versus your own, then you can see how consent becomes an issue.
My question would be, where is this sexual health principle of consent being parsed out through Scripture? If Scripture is a source for understanding and guiding one's sexual life in religious families and religious homes, where is consent being interpreted or looked at, and how is it being addressed in Scripture? People interpret many current contemporary issues through Scripture. This is often done, I think. So where is consent being looked at through Scripture to understand messages of consent?
Yeah, that's a great question. Not that I have a great answer for you. I'll have to. This
might be an area of some study. I don't know, but if Scripture is the source, what does Scripture say about consent in sexual relations? And I don't know.
I think that's fascinating, and it goes back to your point too about shared values, which I do think a lot of probably scriptural shared values, whether it implicitly would be called consent, could definitely fall under the umbrella of consent. Mm-hmm. As far as the care of others, the care of self, etc.
Right. So I think one of the things that maybe is implicit in this conversation, and I'll just kind of back up then a bit around some of the comments I wanted to make about consent, is that I think one of the things that's really, I believe, important about these 6 principles is consent is the fundamental sexual health principle of all aspects of sexual health. There cannot be sexual health without consent.
I would absolutely agree with that.
And what we know around the planet in different cultures and countries and nationalities and laws and religions is that consent is the universal sexual health principle. All nations, all religions talk and have some idea of when sex is consensual. It's just that it varies. How consent is understood culturally is so different. So, for example, age of consent, right? Let's just talk about age of consent. At what age do cultures, nationalities, laws establish that a person is now capable of all responsibility and autonomous decision-making about their own body and sexual activity? And in some countries, they give that to 12-year-olds. By the age of 12, you are considered completely capable of that decision-making. And then we have a bell curve, which gets pretty average, and most people, most nationalities, most countries, it's around the ages of 16 to 18. It's pretty much a very, very common age when people move to having full rights and responsibilities of consent. But there's another end of the bell curve, that in some countries and nationalities and religions, the only people who are able to give consent are people in heterosexual marriages. There's no such thing as consensual sex in those countries unless the sexual activity is happening between a married couple, heterosexual. And so you can see how just that way of looking at consent from a legal kind of when is somebody is varies so much. But nonetheless, they all define when sex is consensual.
Yeah, and that's tricky if you're living in a space where the laws are different than obviously what your inner authenticity would move you towards, right? So
right, and that's where I think this is where what you notice how where you keep using the word consent. Oftentimes the language works against us because we tend to talk not about sexual consent. We tend to talk about non-consent. And we don't even use the words non-consent. What we talk about is sexual abuse, rape, incest, forced sex, date rape. We talk about when the consent sexual health principle is violated in some way. And then we have different languages, different words for different circumstances in which consent is not upheld. The problem with all those words is they talk about when it's violated rather than the aspiration. These principles of sexual health are aspirational. They're destinations, they're visions, they're ways of being ethically on the planet. Where do you stand on the principle of consent in sex is a different question than was that non-consensual. Each person has a responsibility of defining for them, am I engaging in sex that's consensual? So I'm going to go back to this duty circumstance in which you were describing. I still think in this situation, because it's the male and the female with the desire discrepancy and the way you described it in the duty conflict, I still think the male partner has a responsibility of thinking ethically to themselves. At what point is my desire for sex with my partner and this duty principle violating the ethic of non-consent?
Yeah, so can you speak more to that? Because this is where I see couples having a tricky time, especially with the difference between verbal communication versus nonverbal. And I think this is a problem with dating. I think this is a problem with, again, some of the myths and the stereotypes that we've grown up with, is these ideas of, well, she said yes, right? Or he said this, even if maybe the body language was off. And we see this both ways, right? So where, again, stereotypically with the slut shaming that happens in our country, there's sometimes teenage girls who maybe would want to be more sexual, but kind of slyly or coyly say no because they're not supposed to want to be sexual. And so then the young man or other young woman, if she's a lesbian, is getting maybe mixed signals. So right off from the start, I mean, I guess what we can talk about a little bit, if it was the ideal, is that I'm not sure that we get enough information or education on how to even own our own sexuality, which then makes it very difficult to be able to consent to our own sexuality, or sexual behaviors. Because if we can't even own or admit or think about our sexuality as our own entity, do you see what I'm saying? It's kind of like problems just start off right from the bat.
The word you used in the sentence was consent, give our own consent. I don't think what you're talking about consent is, I think you're talking about permission. Do we give ourselves permission to follow our desires and our interests? And when our desires conflict with gender scripts or who we're supposed to be in the eyes of God or whatever it may be, then we might be conflicted about whether we give ourselves permission. I think consent is a different threshold.
I love being able to think about those two things differently. So yes, please continue.
That consent is the ultimate authority of sexual activity. This is one body being touched or penetrated or pleasured by another human body, skin to skin, penetration, contact, bodies making contact. And the ultimate ethic is when human beings engage in that kind of connection, it needs to be consensual and not forced or a violation of another person's autonomy or free will to give consent. So has the person on their own free will given consent? And is the person who's engaged in the sexual activity obtained consent in a clear, unequivocal way? This is what the conversation is now in our society. We are shifting the balance a bit more here to putting responsibility on the more aggressive partner, if we want to call it that, or the initiating partner, or the higher desire partner. They too have a responsibility of having unequivocal clarity that each step of the sexual encounter is one in which the partner has given consent and said yes. And if the person is unclear about that, they have a responsibility to slow down and get clarity, rather than the only person who has responsibility is the person who's ambivalent.
Right. So that gives it a lot more complexity for that higher desire person, because now what I'm hearing you say, and you can correct me if I'm wrong, is that the verbal yes may not be sufficient if the body language is off, or there's some other contextual piece there that needs maybe more exploration.
Now, we do this all the time. We're sitting at a restaurant. We've had a lovely meal. The server comes out and says, gee, you want dessert? And everybody looks around the table like, is it who's going to say yes, who's going to say no, right? They don't know. And then they might say, oh, we'll look at the menu. And so then they look at the menu. And it's like everybody's looking around, should we do dessert? Should we not? Da-da-da-da-da. And people know how to do this if it's about ordering apple pie. They just talk about it. And they may be ambivalent, and they may be getting given mixed. And somebody looks at, oh, I think you really want that pie. And the person goes, well, no, I think about it. I think I'm really full. I don't think I want that pie. I'm really good. And they have a kind of clarity. But their first response isn't the clear one. You have to talk more.
I really like that idea that these seem like obvious things, right? That it's obviously both partners' responsibility.
I don't think it's obvious at all.
But
because
it's not.
I'm going to disagree with you. I don't think it's obvious because culturally we have not sent these messages.
Right.
That we have actually sent messages that actually one person in the sexual encounter is more responsible for consent. Even in laws, in cases of rape and those sorts of things, we have held it up in a court of law that the person who is accusing of rape is held accountable for having given clear messages of no. And that is a significant reason to not have a rape have occurred, not because it wasn't forced, but because the person who didn't want it didn't do a good enough job of protesting.
Correct. Versus there's no emphasis on the other party, like there's nobody asking that person, how did you get consent or things of that nature. Right.
And that's the shift in the balance of the discussion now that's literally in the last 10 years is happening in our country in the law. I think we have to kind of give everybody in the country a kind of some empathy here that this is not stuff people have been being taught.
Do you want to talk about the ethically, morally, and social etiquette parts of consent?
Right. I think everybody has to kind of come to their position from a moral position. Do I believe sex should always be consensual? And this one is a fairly easy one. Most people believe absolutely sex should be consensual. They do. To a very small minority of people who say, no, sex doesn't have to be consensual.
Right. And this is why it feels like it's so simple, because everybody agrees on this, even though the dialogue is not simple, to your point.
That's right. So just because people are so certain, of course I would never want to be engaged in non-consensual sex, they think because they have moral certainty, they know how to negotiate consent. That's a thinking error.
So just because you believe in it doesn't mean that you know how to do it.
Exactly. I believe I am going to become a vegetarian. I believe in vegetarianism. I want to be a vegetarian. It's the moral way. I can't imagine putting anything in my body that had eyes and smiled. I just can't do it. It's a moral principle for me. Now, does that mean I know how to do it?
Right. So can we move the conversation then into how do we become consensualites? I mean, that's kind of what we're talking about, right?
Yeah, right. I think how I would translate the sentence you just said is, how do we operationalize consent so that it doesn't ruin pleasure?
Right, because then you get the classic, it's not hot. And I hear this from both sides, right? So, again, there's usually an initiator and a receiver. You know, I'll hear from women oftentimes, yeah, he asked if he could kiss me, and it kind of blew the moment. And I'm like, oh, wow, you know, like, I'm kind of glad he asked if he could kiss you.
So I would ask a woman at that moment, help me understand your erotic world. How is it for you that when a man asks you for a kiss, it inhibits your excitement for the kiss? Let's explore that.
What's your hopes in asking that question? In other words, what insights are you hoping come up? Or how do you move from erotic templates and erotic ideas to, which are very much a part of what we'd like to experience, right, from the pleasure perspective, to real life interactions?
If you're asking a person to explore that moment, why is when somebody says, gee, may I kiss you, that for that person, that diminishes their excitement and arousal, that diminishes their pleasure in the moment. Sexual excitement, sexual response is a combination of excitement and inhibitors. And so if a woman is saying, gee, I was just about to be kissed, and she was maybe really excited and looking forward to it, and she was really kind of getting a bit aroused by in that moment. And then the person who's about to kiss her says, may I kiss you? And she feels just a kind of a deflation of that building arousal and excitement. It's important for the woman to try to understand, why is that? Why was that an inhibitor? How did that interfere with her arousal? It could be multitude of explanations, but I think it's important from a self-awareness perspective. Rather than blaming the guy for asking, you need to take responsibility. How is that particular dynamic sexually an inhibitor for you? And then maybe do you need to explain that or somehow help your partners know that? Like, talking turns it off for me. So there has to be a point at which we're not talking anymore, because if we talk, it just turns me off, and I need to let you know that.
Which in of itself is talking.
Right. But you need to have this conversation when genitals are nicely packed away and not ready for excitement.
Right.
You know, that's when you have that conversation, not when genitals are out. That's not the best time to have that conversation.
And this gets to one of, I think, the guidelines, or I think one of the teaching, and if we could come up with a great way to teach consent that would be kind of like a driver's ed type of metaphor, one of the things we would talk about is how to have these conversations, like you're saying, outside of the bedroom or outside of the places you're going to be erotic, before arousal happens, as a normal part of figuring out whether or not you're a good match, just basic dating protocol, right? We talk about our backgrounds, we talk about what do you like, we talk about what are you currently doing in your life. There's a certain script that comes along with most dating conversations, and this doesn't seem to fit into that very well, or most people haven't.
Well, there's another element of consent that, in talking about it as a sexual health principle, that is very difficult, and that's that probably 1 out of every 3 adult women who's engaged in sexual activity has a history of already being violated non-consensually by the age of 18.
And I believe that it's fairly high for men as well, isn't it? Like 1 in 7 or...
Right. With men, we think it's about 1 in 4.
1 in 4.
So we're even thinking these statistics are underreported. But even at that, That's a quarter of the population of the country of men. And that's a third of the population of this country of women. How many things can you say, a third of the population of the country, this is relevant? That this has been a violation of their sexual health.
Right.
25% of all men have had their sexual health principle of consent violated by the time they're age of 18. That's a lot of people. And so when we talk about this sexual right, the sexual health principle of consent, and we want to proactively address this as a health issue, we also then have to talk about non-consent. When people should be learning about consent in childhood, hopefully before they reach puberty, is when most non-consensual violations occur.
Pre-puberty, you mean?
Yes.
Yes.
Right. And so what does this mean to teach children about consent? And we know most non-consent in children, the lion's share, the vast majority, 80-90% of the non-consent experienced by children under the age of 18 is by somebody they know.
Right.
The most dangerous place for non-consent in America is the family home.
Right.
So how do you teach consent when the non-consent is happening in your home? When 1/3 of Americans are experiencing that, or 1/4 of Americans who are growing up are experiencing that? How do you teach it? It's a big problem.
Right. So do you have thoughts and ideas about this? Because as you're talking about it, I mean, we've definitely seen, if we've seen anything shift maybe in the last, I don't know, dare I say 40 years without looking anything up, just out of my brain.
Yeah.
The concepts of sexual privacy and safety types of lessons are currently being taught in our schools. You know, like I remember as a mom getting even in kindergarten, getting the little piece of paper that you give consent for your child to have this talk that had to do with sexual safety. You know, and they talk about basic things like who can touch you where and things like that. So we have seen, I guess, some level of increase, I think, in at least addressing this topic in our country anyway. But I know that that's not enough. And I know that there's lots of, I mean, we could probably do a whole podcast just on this topic, obviously. But what are your thoughts and ideas about where we've been, what we've tried, where we need to go?
Yeah, I've attended child sexual abuse conferences and taught at them and taught about sexual health at child sexual abuse treatment conferences internationally as well as in the U.S. And one of the things I find is that this is a very complicated discussion because we're comfortable talking about consent and non-consent when we talk about how it's already been a violation. You know, that's bad touch or that's not supposed to happen. We don't say there's a thing called sexual touch, not just touch. There's a thing called sexual touch. And you have a particular right to consent when it comes to sexual touch. There may be all sorts of touch that has to happen for all sorts of reasons, and you may have to negotiate it. But sexual touch is a certain kind of consent and permission. And that's what's absent from the conversation. Because if you talk about sexual touch, you have to talk about sex. And that this thing called sex happens. And now we have conversations that are so full of values conflicts and fears and emotions, it just becomes almost impossible.
Can you give an example of a phrase that you would say is addressing sexual touch versus bad touch?
Johnny, that's your penis. The only person who gets to touch your penis is you. And anybody else who asks to touch your penis, they should ask for permission first. And you get to say no, and they should stop if you say no. That's the way it works the rest of your life.
And so that would be an example of sexual touch talk.
Right. You're not talking about intercourse. But, you know,
Right.
That's something to talk to a young child about.
And how would it have gone if it was just bad touch talk? How would it be different?
They wouldn't have talked about penises. These sexual abuse training programs don't talk about people having penises and vaginas when it's good touch, bad touch. They don't even use the word penis. So, for example, there's a measure that's given at a child sexual abuse treatment program. This measure is used all over the country when children are sexually abused. And it's called it's a word knowledge scale for children 1 to 5. And they get a sense of all the words kids know, because words are very helpful with preventing harm for kids. They have to have vocabulary and know what words are. So they have the parent fill out all the different words the child knows. And there's a section on this scale for body parts and knowledge of body parts. The word vagina, vulva, penis, and testicles does not appear on the body knowledge list on this measure. Now, can you imagine being a parent and your 4-year-old was digitally penetrated by the babysitter, and that babysitter was arrested, and your child is in treatment for child sexual abuse treatment, and the parent goes through this assessment measure, looks at body parts, and they go, at a child sexual abuse treatment center, they don't even want to know if my child knows the word vagina, and their vagina's been penetrated through rape? That's really interesting. I guess we only need to know about vaginas after they've been raped.
Well, and I know that this is one of the issues that happens a lot with even assessing sexual abuse for children, is that children themselves will say, well, you know, he touched my lollipop, or he touched my ding-ding, or she touched my lolly, or, you know, and so then how is an assessor supposed to know what those terms even mean? It's an issue for everyone.
So the problem is we have language, specific language around body parts or sexual activity that is so value-laden and so emotionally reactive for so many people. We just avoid the whole thing by not using those words. And when we avoid those words, we don't empower people to learn about consent. You can't really learn about consent without using the language of sex and sexual body parts or genitals, or, you know, you've got to use real words. And people get very concerned that knowing the word penis for a 7-year-old might create a kind of depravity in that child, or might create a kind of loss of innocence in the child, or might create a prurient interest in the body that would be immoral if the child knows that word.
So we're definitely getting the message that education is so significantly important from a very early age in the realm of sexuality, sexual anatomy, and sexual language.
Yeah, which are all contributors to being able to learn about sexual consent before you're violated.
Yeah, and I've even heard a lot more people talking about simple things like shifting the familial roles to, instead of being worried about hurting grandma's feelings by forcing young children to give hugs, that we are now becoming a little bit more interested in honoring the child's feelings and their autonomy, and if they don't want to particularly hug somebody, they don't have to just because they're a family member, or that it's a socially ascribed thing to do. Any thoughts about that?
So imagine a parent going to visit grandma and grandpa, and they walk in and their 4-year-old is shy and is not up to wanting to do the full greeting, and grandma's got her arms out, and the parent might look at grandma and say, Mom, we've been really working with Amanda on consent. We just think this is so important for her. So we'd like you to judge if you think Amanda's ready to give you a kiss. And if she doesn't give you the signal she wants a kiss, let her know that's okay, because we're really wanting to empower our children to know they have the right to say no to being touched. We're working on this right now, so help us out.
I love that. That's great role modeling. Thank you. Okay, so moving on then to other ways that we can address, again, if you were in charge of consent education, or the things that need to be addressed in our culture to be much better at this word that we've been talking about.
Yeah.
Obviously, childhood education, it starts early. What else would be on your list as far as things that either we can start addressing at the pre-adolescent or adolescent levels, or even in adult relational types of settings?
I think the primary sexual health conversation that happens in the lives of children, it's almost an obsession in the preoccupation with this conversation, is when a youth or a young adult has a morally correct sexual debut. In other words, when the first intercourse occurs, under what circumstance does that occur, is a moral dimension in every society on the planet. And we spend so much time focusing on the correct moment for the sexual debut. And we avoid discussing the sexual consent.
Yeah, for example, a marriage, it's a very typical time frame, at least in Christian cultures, where that's an okay time to start having sex. Mm-hmm. And yet, for example, I have many, again, maybe more conservative clients that have waited to do quite a bit until marriage. So maybe they've just kissed lightly or done some basic embraces, and even the moment of marriage has not necessarily prepared them for the type of intimacy that they're going to be sharing having intercourse. Mm-hmm. So this is one of the things I talk about oftentimes in my pre-marriage type of sessions, is kind of assessing how ready you are to have quote unquote intercourse even after marriage, and that it's okay to not necessarily follow that script that we have to have penetrative sex the evening of the wedded bliss.
So the conversation might be something like, consent is always your right, even after marriage. So if you're not ready and wanting and really able to consent and give permission to intercourse, you have the right to wait until you're ready. The other partner may assume that because the marriage is now legal and completed and before the eyes of God has been made, there may be a sense that now I have the right to intercourse. I have been maintaining the consent boundary, not because I didn't want to have sex with this person, but because I wanted to uphold the moral and religious expectations of waiting until marriage. Then there might be the expectation by somebody else that now consent isn't as essential. Now it's about my right to intercourse versus I still need to make sure my partner is consenting and wanting this.
Yeah, and the normalization of exactly what you're talking about, that for a myriad of reasons and issues and, well, all kinds of things, people's arousal and desire and ideas about when and why to be sexual shift throughout the lifetime of your life. So It is a constant conversation that should be happening within long-term relationships.
So consent, in other words, what I'm hearing you say, Natasha, consent is always a sexual health principle that's present in the life of people. There are certain milestones or moments where consent really is at the forefront, but it's always a sexual health principle that needs to be respected and aspired to in all our sexual lives.
Yeah, and another sad theme I think that I'm thinking of as you speak of this idea of having a certain moment where it's now okay to have sex, like a marriage ceremony, is that those that may have premarital experiences that are quite enjoyable, are quite consensual, are not necessarily always honored by the culture or the society because it's missing that moment, right? It's missing that culturally ascribed or morally ascribed moment, even though maybe both partners really felt, or even like some of the homosexual couples that you're talking about where it's not even legal in certain countries or things of that nature. And so it can be very consensual, it can be very pleasurable, it can be very honoring of their relationship, and yet we as a society will not honor that with them.
Right. So in other words, this is an interesting other maybe dimension of consent. Perhaps as this couple is engaging in more and more sexual, pleasurable contact, but not having intercourse until marriage to keep aligned with their religious beliefs and expectations. And so here they are all this time before that moment. They're doing really well with consent. Wow, this is so cool. But they don't get to feel proud of that consent because they may feel ambivalent about engaging in that sexual activity prior to marriage.
Right. We don't, as the educators or the mentors or the older generation, we don't necessarily honor that or congratulate that because we're looking at this other marker.
Right. So I think when people are so preoccupied with the value aspect of sexual health, is my sexual activity within my value system, that becomes such a preoccupying component that the issue of was it consensual, and then we didn't talk about this yet, but we will at some point, non-exploitive, was it consensual and non-exploitive, doesn't get its due and honor and celebration because all that really gets focused on is the value dimension of the sex.
Right. Yeah, I think it is very dangerous to tell adolescents, for example, which I know we do in our culture, is setting up this narrative of as long as you're married, everything will be fine, everything will work out, everything's going to be okay. And implied in that is the sexual piece that, again, nobody's really talking about directly, that that's when you're going to have great sex. And we're not really understanding that there's marriages where there's horrific sexual abuse taking place, and there's non-marriages where there's beautiful sexuality taking place. So that's an incorrect myth.
So I would translate those sentences is there are relationships that are not following those values of waiting till marriage and all that, and yet they're upholding the consent sexual health principle. And they're aligned with not exploiting each other, but they're violating that value. And there are people who get married and have waited until marriage, and they've kept the value of waiting for intercourse until marriage. They did a really great job of that. But once they got into the situation where their intercourse was morally correct, they weren't having consensual sex, and they were having exploitive sex.
You're so much better at putting it into words. No, I love that. That's absolutely right. Okay, I want to touch on
that's what I thought you were saying. I mean,
it was absolutely what I was saying. You just reframed it so much more beautifully.
Well, what I did, Natasha, is I integrated the principles of sexual health into the narrative.
Well, and I love how you're role modeling that, because I want to get much better at that as well. One thing I wanted to touch on briefly, because I know this comes up often, is the erotic template of non-consent. In other words, a lot of times with my trauma victims, which we talked about, there's a lot of people out there with a lot of stories around non-consent. I'll often have victims in my office really confused about the idea that part of their erotic template is having non-consensual types of encounters, usually in play, right? Like, I like it when I pretend that my husband is raping me, for example, or in the safe context of it actually not being a rape. But they're concerned that this means they're broken, that there's something wrong with them. Like, why would I want that? Why would I find that erotic? Or the other way around as well, where it's fun to think about doing something that my partner isn't consensual about, even though they're not necessarily behaving non-consensually. So do you want to talk a little bit about that complication?
Right. I'm going to first make the distinction between there are people whose erotic and sexual desires specifically require some sort of non-consent in order to feel the pleasure. For example, some people are attracted to minors. Their love attractions, who they're attracted to, in much the way almost everybody's attracted to adults, they're attracted to minors. And they do experience the same feelings with minors that most of us feel with adults. And that's a real experience some human beings have. And that's a non-consensual erotic attraction. Some people consider it a sexual orientation. It's an actual orientation some people have. So that's non-consensual sexual orientation. And these people have a very, very serious conundrum in managing their lives without being in prison and hurting people and committing crimes. And so they need help if they feel this, they're experiencing this. The dilemma in our country is people who have minor attractions or who have acted on these non-consensual interests don't think they can get help until they've committed a crime and been arrested. It's very difficult for somebody to walk into a mental health clinic and say, I have minor attractions, I need help. I don't want to abuse a minor, and I need help with this so I don't commit a crime and hurt somebody.
Yeah, that's very understandable.
We kind of leave these folks in the lurch and offer them no really direction on how to live with minor attraction. They're all on their own with this usually. And not everybody who has minor attraction actually has sex with minors. There's people with minor attraction who spend their entire life avoiding making sure they never hurt a kid.
Yeah, I thought I read somewhere that actually that's the higher statistic, that there's more people that have those types of attractions than actually would act on them.
There's a belief about that, yeah. I mean, how do we do statistics on this? It's tough,
right.
But this is a notion that people are beginning to wonder if this is really kind of what's happening out there. So minor attraction, and then there are people whose erotic template involves some sort of sexual interaction with another adult, but it involves non-consent. So, in other words, I may want to watch another adult undress, or I may want to watch somebody having sexual activity with somebody else and without their permission and consent. I may want somebody to view my body naked, or I may want somebody to view my genitals. I may want somebody to view my penis while it's erect. I'm wanting that to happen without the person seeing it, giving me permission to show it to them. And some people have erotic interests. Other people have some erotic interests where I want to touch somebody. I want to place my hand or my body in some way touching another person's body without their permission. But if I do it in a certain way, it's extremely sexually arousing to me. And these are people who have non-consensual sexual interests. And they're oftentimes, for some people, fixed erotic interests, meaning they don't reach orgasm without fantasizing about doing this or actually engaging in the activity and then remembering it later while they masturbate. That's their sexual lives. That's how they have pleasure in sex. So those are people with non-consensual erotic interests and arousers. There's a whole group of people like that. And then there's what you described, people who have fantasies, role plays. Then there's this other group of people who are engaged in fantasy arousal around the non-consent continuum. They either fantasize about it, they like to do role plays or scene play. They like to experiment with the elements of non-consent as part of their arousal or reaching orgasm, or maybe looking at videos or looking at sexual imagery, either professionally produced or amateur, or they read erotic literature, and they like this fantasy, they like these experiences. The dilemma is people have enormous self-criticism for having these fantasies. I mean, the judgments and criticisms people have about themselves when they first discover the possibility of this arouser. Most people have lots of harsh judgments about these interests. Not everybody initially, but many people do. And so oftentimes people live in shame or secrecy because that's their way of living with the judgment, is I'm going to hide it.
That really plays into the other sexual principle of values, right? Because it's oftentimes that's where that guilt or shame is coming from, is it doesn't fit with their value system.
Right. So what I like to say to people is, good for you. You believe in the consent sexual principle. I'm so happy for you. Isn't this great? This is why you have the conflict, because you believe in the consent sexual principle. So now, how do we get you to enjoy your fantasies and have pleasure with them without thinking you're violating consent sexual health principle?
Exactly, because if it's fantasy and you're playing out something that everybody has agreed to, then it's still consensual.
That's right, and it can be pleasurable. And for some people, it might be so pleasurable, it's the best way they enjoy sex.
Right.
But people are judged often for what arouses them. There's all sorts of scripts about what is supposed to arouse us and what is not supposed to arouse us. And religion is one of the sources of those scripts of what is supposed to arouse you and what's not. And when people feel like their arousers conflict with authorities who tell you how you're supposed to be aroused, and a person is highly invested in aligning their sexual life with that authority, and religion is often a place for that, boy, these are painful secrets and difficulties and angst, and oh my gosh, it's tough stuff for many people.
That's awesome. I think that's a very important part of the conversation as well. I have taken your hour that I promised I would try to keep this within. So I would just love to hear closing thoughts on consent. This is our episode on consent. So,
yeah, I think the good news about consent as a sexual health principle is that most human beings on the planet agree that sex should be consensual. It's not a big debate that sex should be consensual. So we need to really reinforce people who believe this. I've had clients I've worked with when I've introduced the 6 principles of sexual health, and I've had men in my office start crying because they'll look at me and they say, well, I got at least one of them, and it's the consent one. We need to let people feel good about the fact that they believe sex should be consensual. They need to feel good that it's an aspiration they believe in and it's a value they hold deeply. Just because it's a value we hold deeply doesn't mean we always actualize and always live in congruent with it. when we don't live in congruency with the consent sexual value, or somebody else has violated that with us, the reason it's so painful, the reason it's so terrible, is because we all believe sex should be consensual. And it's that egregious of a violation. That's why it's such a big deal, because consent is the center of all sexual health.
Thank you, Doug. That's a wonderful ending to this dialogue, and I'm sure we could have spent easily another 4 hours talking about something like this. And if anything, I hope the audience starts understanding that. When I talk about the principles of sexual health, I think exactly because of what you just said, it almost gets dismissed like consent. Of course, yeah, we all agree on that. So it's
right.
Not like, okay, next, because that's an obvious one. And yes, it may be obvious, and yes, we all may, for the most part, agree with it, but the dialogue is what needs to be deepened, and the conversations with our partners, with our children, with our colleagues, with the circles in our lives. This is such an important piece of really helping us achieve healthy and pleasurable sexual experiences with those that matter most to us. So thank you so much.
Yeah.
Tune in, because the next one will be talking about exploitation. So thank you, Doug, for coming on the show.
Thank you, Natasha, for having me and providing an hour for people to really think about a sexual health principle, which is such a rare space for people to be given. So I really applaud you for making space for whoever's listening to this.
Thank you.
We took the long road home, turned minutes into miles, and as the evening traveled on, the sunset bathed your smile. We stopped beneath the desert stars, wrapped in each other's arms. Was as simple as I love you, an ordinary, extraordinary
a trail with tears, pain and sorrow too. But through every storm we traveled on, like lovers do. And if sometimes we fell apart, we always came back home. Was as simple as I love you, an ordinary, extraordinary Some people say love is blind and forever is too long. But I see your eyes in every sunrise, can't imagine life alone. Let's take the long road on together until we're gone. Want you by my side till the day I die and into
as simple as our love is. That's how I